Peter Bell, and this is me little mate Alfie. He's not very big, but he's pretty tough. And today I'd like to just give you a brief outline on the establishment of the Mount White sheep run. Mount White Station is situated about 100 miles west of Christchurch, and it borders onto the Arthur's Pass National Park. Mount White Station incorporates all of the Poulter River and Valley and all of the Esk River and Valley, and the total area of the whole of the Mount White Station is in excess of 125,000 acres. The earliest settlers that established themselves at Mount White were Edward and Frederick Minchin, who set up camp about 6 miles up the Poulter River from where it enters into the Waimaka area. They set about and built a homestead up there, and consequently, if you know about the Mount White area, it was after the Minchin brothers that the lake was named after. Mount White had many owners since the Minchins established themselves in the middle 1850s. And it wasn't until the 1920s that the Turnbull family purchased Mount White and have operated the place since that time. One of the early settlers at Mount White was a Major Thomas White, who with his wife and 2 younger brothers set about to establish what is now known as the Mount White homestead area. Welcome to Mount White Sheep Station. Major White commenced work on the first Mount White homestead in 1861. He, his 2 younger brothers and his wife set about to establish the first homestead to be built at Mount White Station. The homestead was finished in about 1864. This shows the first wool shed that was built at Mount White about that time. In the background is the lake called Lake Letitia, so named after Major White's wife. This is looking at the lake due east towards the Paketi Range with the first skiff of snow of the autumn. And this is looking from the opposite direction back towards the homestead. This next picture is probably the best picture in the whole of the series that John and I have done. It's a magnificent picture of Lake Letitia taken from the top of Chess Peak looking into the Poulter Valley. The old Mount White homestead stood for 100 years, and it was occupied for all that time by owners, managers, families, friends and travellers. After 100 years it was decided that the old homestead had had its day and it was time for it to be demolished and done away with. As you can see, in the early days, they insulated the old homestead with snow tussocks and reeds which were gathered from the lake's edge to ward off the very intense cold that people were subjected to at Mount White during the winter months. In place of the old homestead, it was decided to build a new manager's home with permanent materials which was well suited for Mount White given the very intense winters that are experienced in that part. Next picture shows the old homestead in all its glory. The lovely vegetable garden, the walkway up the middle, and in the top of, almost under the veranda of the old homestead, is a little water race that used to feed an old water wheel of earlier times. Here is the same plot of land after the old homestead had been demolished and pulled down. No foundation, no chimney pots, nothing to indicate that people had inhabited this little piece of land for 100 years. The only thing to show up on that picture is the little lone red amber tree in the middle of the picture. Nothing else. This is the water wheel that generated electricity for the old homestead. It was constructed and put into operation around about the 1900s, and it operated and produced electricity for the house for about 50 odd years. It too fell into disrepair, and it ceased working in around about 1948 or 1949. The water wheel was operated by a water flume that was constructed over the top of the wheel, and as the water cascaded down, this in turn drove the wheel round and generated electricity, which, as I understand, was around about 12 volts, and there was only ever enough produced to supply the old homestead. In the winter, of course, this water wheel used to freeze over, and of course there was no electricity, and the people that were inhabiting the house then had to revert back to candles and kerosene lamps until the thaw in the spring, when they could have once again electricity in the homestead. G'day. Just like to say a few words about the huts that we used to live in while I was employed at Mount White as a packman. Mount White was a farm of around about 120,000 acres, and as you can understand, the huts were spread pretty much apart. The farthest most hut on Mount White from the homestead, I would have estimated, would be something like 40 to 45 miles away, and if you had to get on a horse and get out to those places, it was a long slog all the way with a pack team under sometimes good conditions, sometimes bad. But when you got to those huts and you flung the door open, and here was this little corrugated iron hut waiting to greet you, you flung the door open and hey, you went into the hut and thought, oh boy, this is home for a few days. A number of the huts that I went to were in the bush, some were out in the flats, but mainly they were fairly accessible to where stock was mustered off the hill. The huts were all constructed of corrugated iron, walls and roof and so forth, and they all had 8 bunks in them, 4 on top of 4. Half of the huts had wooden floors and half of them had a sort of a half by rough old floor that had been put in. Those that were nearer the homestead where material could be taken out for that purpose. At the end of the hut there was an open fire where I did all of the cooking, and it was a pleasure to cook on some of those open fire things with the camp ovens, because when these musterers came off the hill tired and worn out after 6 or 8 hours punching into all sorts of conditions and stuff like that, when they got to the hut it all came in and there was a beautiful meal waiting for them, beautifully presented. It sort of made your day and you thought, hey, at least I've achieved something. Now some of these other huts that I went to were closer to the homestead and we didn't stay in them a great deal of time, but we frequented these huts in the summer for the shearing muster, and then in the autumn for the autumn muster to bring the sheep off the high country at the back of Mount White. And the little huts that were there, they were home to all the musterers and they were a great little place to stay. The water that supplied these huts all came out of a creek. There was no collection of water off the roofs or anything else like that. And our wash house was the creek, and that's where the water came from for all the cooking and all the stuff that we used in the hut. And so there's not a great deal more I can tell you about the huts, other than when you see these slides running past very shortly, I'll make the odd comment about some of them, and I hope that you'll find that they are interesting, and I hope you enjoy them. Thank you. White huts were home to the mustering gang for quite a few weeks of every season. The little huts didn't change much over the years. From when they were first built around about the turn of the century, they housed the musterers and the packmen. And things didn't change very much over all of those years. The wee hut was made of corrugated iron and had an open fire and bunks in it. It was always a great place for the musterers to ride home after a hard day, have a meal and shelter the wee hut. Some huts at Mount White were better than others, and as a general rule, the huts that were by the bush or near the bush edge with a running stream were always the better huts to stay in. Plenty of fresh water, shelter for the bit of bush, and they were a great little place. It was like having a holiday and actually getting paid for it. I remember one time at Cattle Creek we ran out of tucker. The boss said to me, how much longer can we go? And I said, not long. We hung about for a day or two and then we made a dash for the homestead in the snow. And as you can see in these pictures here, the little Cattle Creek hut with the snow all around it. And the next one of the musterers and myself, the dogs and the horses, heading to the homestead in the snow, 11.5 hours. It was a grueling trip. Cold, wet. When I look back on it now, you can't buy that sort of experience. The wee huts were homely, hot as hell in the summer, and cold as bloody charity in the winter. But you didn't take too much notice of that when you're in there. You were there to do a job, and you did the job to the best of your ability. In later times, there were more modern huts built with more modern material. They were insulated, they had gas cookers, rubber mattresses, and they were a pleasure to stay in. And so as time moved on, the huts got better, conditions got better, but notwithstanding, the work still had to be done, and the tired musters still had to come back to the hut at night to be greeted by this very happy packman waiting for them. And so these wee huts that were built about 100 years ago, some of them, might still be there in 100 years' time. It's hard to say. It's a shame to see some of them get pulled down, and in the case of the Riversdale hut, the little cottage at Riversdale, burnt down. But I suppose that's what happens, and it's something that you can't prevent. And so the wee huts were our home for a long time, and it was very nice to stay in them. I want to talk briefly about my association with the horses that I had when I was employed at Mount White as a packman some 50 odd years ago. When I first went to Mount White was a very basic place. No frills, people employed to do a job and do it properly and do it competently, which all of the people that I worked with over the years there were capable of doing. You had to be able to ride a horse, kill a sheep, shear a sheep, do all the things associated with the backcountry. And Mount White at that time ran about 15 or 16,000 good merino sheep. They also had 500 or 600 good Hereford cattle beasts and about 20 or so horses, along with dogs and all the other bits and pieces that made up Mount White. But particularly the horses. Now, of those 20 odd horses they had at Mount White, 5 of them were pack horses that I used in my pack team to cart the food and the bedding and everything out the back when we used the huts in the summertime for the shear and muster, and in the autumn time for the autumn musters. The horses I had were half to 3/4 grown, and they were a wonderful team of horses to work with. Of all of the years that I spent there with the pack team, I didn't ever have any mishap with any of the horses except on one very minor occasion. I had a big horse there called Joe, and Joe fell over a bit of a bluff, and he went down and he was wriggling and squirming and putting on an act, and I got the wind up because I thought, well, if I've got to get the gun out and shoot him, it means that I've got to cart all the gear to the hut, which is about another 20 miles, and I didn't want that. So I tied my hack up and went down the bank, and I laid a hairy panel into his rib cage, and he got such a fright that he squirmed and wriggled, and he got up, and eventually I clambered up the cliff face with him and let him go, and away he went. Now, the horses were at Mount White. They did a great job. They did a wonderful job. And as I've said before on a number of occasions, it's all very well having sheep and cattle and dogs and buildings and huts and everything, but without the horses, Mount White would not have, it couldn't operate without the horses, because it's only in latter years that they got bulldozers and they put tracks in for four-wheel drive vehicles, and even had blooming helicopters carting stuff out the back and so on. But we that belonged to that gang all those years ago, we had something that we treasured. We thought it was great. The horses were wonderful, and I shall never forget having worked with such a wonderful team of horses during the time that I was at Mount White. I'm going to talk now about the horses at Mount White. I have talked earlier about the pack team that I worked with at Mount White, but I want to talk now more generally about the hacks that were on the station. The horses were bred on the station and broken in on the station, and this little horse that's coming up now was bred on the station, and it was broken in by Sylvie Eaton, who, when he left Mount White in the middle 60s, he bought the little horse and took him away, and he played a major part in the rodeos around the North Island. The little horse lived, I believe, till he was about 38. These are some of the other
horses that were bred at Mount White, and they were used primarily by the musterers, mustering cattle and the river flats around the Waimak. And then the old pack horses heading down to one of the camps out the back. And this was the horse that was used at Mount White to breed the foals as a white stallion and the mother of the little foal there. These horses that were bred at Mount White weren't overly heavy horses, but they were fit, sturdy and reliable. And these horses that were bred at Mount White were tough in the sense that they come from an environment that was cold and rivers and all sorts of things. And of course they adapted very, very well for the use in the hill country of Mount White. This is one of my pack horses. This was a little horse called Bell, this little horse, and I had it packed up one day to head out the back, and the manager's little daughter said, "Can I have a ride on the horse?" And I said, "You hop up there and I'll take your photograph." So that was the little girl on the horse, and there's pictures of the horses in the snow going out the back to muster in the autumn. And the old pack horses, of course, they were faithful and they just punched into it. And it didn't matter what the conditions were. You loaded the horse up, there was no squabble, no quibble. Loaded him up and away he went, and he was very faithful, and he went out to the huts. And as I've mentioned before, without the horses, you'd be had it. You couldn't waste the time. In the very early days, of course, they had a track out the back, a rough track, and they used to take the little wagon out there, the man that lived at Nigger Hill. This is a part of Mount White that I call the scenic railway, and I might have mentioned that Joe fell over the edge here one day, and I had to go down and lay the leather on him. And if you look at the pinnacles in the middle of this picture here, it was about 20 feet from the top where the horses are walking through that Joe fell over. But he got over it, and I got over it, and I didn't have to carry all the swags to the next hut. This is the horse that I rode for all the years I was at Mount White, a very faithful horse called Jean. You'd shoot a deer or a pig off her back with a 303 rifle, and she didn't flinch, she didn't bat an eyelid. She was a wonderful horse. This next picture shows a fella that worked there, the packman, myself in fact, and he's clutching a half G that he bought at the Springfield pub. Probably the only one that ever took a half G to Nigger Hill. And when all the musterers went mustering that day, and it was a hot stinking day, I lay under the birch trees and I drank it and sang a couple of cowboy ballads and had a roll your own fag, and it was really lovely. These are pictures of the pack team going out round Lochinvar and Cattle Creek and the wee tarn behind Nigger Hill. Lovely old horse here called Mule, and she was going through the wee creek, through what we called to going up to Lochinvar and up the Nigger Stream. This was a thirsty musterer, come off at Bottom Packety one day. I snuck home early and I took all the musters down a lovely cold bottle of beer, and they appreciated that very much indeed. One time I brought a pack team down the Esk River from below the Nigger Hill hut, and it was a gruelling trip down through the shingle slides and cliffs and all sorts of things, and I punched down through there to Bottom Packety. It took a long time, but we eventually got there, and I always think was one of the few that ever took a pack team down the Esk to Bottom Packety. A couple of old pack horses here ready, loaded up, heading out to Nigger Hill. arrived at Nigger Hill one day with the pack team, tied my hack up, and lo and behold, a couple of pigs left from the back of the hut. They'd been living around the hut for a few weeks. So I whipped the rifle out and blew the sow over. And so we had a bit of pork for a few days. This was Joe, Big Joe. He fell over the cliff. Nothing wrong with him there. He looks fit as. He was a good horse, Joe. He had feet like frying pans, but he was still a very good horse. And then we have the wee horses out on the prairie, free, galloping into the nor'wester. Lovely horses. Beautiful.